Hi guys, so I'm here to do my end of month reading wrap up for January. You may have already seen, but I did do a mid-month wrap up this month where I reviewed for you all of the books I read in the first half of the month because I've been reading quite a lot. I think partly because January is just a bit dark and miserable. It feels like it goes on forever and ever, and man am I glad it's over. But I think because of that I've read quite a lot. Although I think also length and genre has something to do with that, and quite a few of the things I'm going to review here are quite short. But that doesn't mean I don't have lots of thoughts on them, so I am just going to crack on with it and start with the non-fiction books. There was two in the second half of the month. The first one was Inside This Place, Not Of It, Narratives from Women's Prison. This is edited by Robin Levi and Aint Waldman. It has a foreword by Michelle Alexander, who wrote the book The New Jim Crow. I haven't read that, but it sounds and is meant to be amazing, and I have seen her talk on documentaries about the topic of race and prisons and sort of racism within the incarceration system. It's a book that's been produced by this organisation I hadn't heard of before called Voice of Witness, and they are a non-profit group that focus on producing works like this, so texts like this, so that document oral history. So all of the essays, you could call them, or voices in this collection are women who have either been in prison or are currently in prison, and they've shared their story orally with those documenting what's inside of this book. And it was published by Verso, who are one of my favourite non-fiction publishers. So, you know, I had a lot of good things going into it, and it very much delivered. This book was really hard-hitting. It was harrowing to read. I found myself on the verge of tears on public transport multiple times, but it's such an important book. Like, I really want more people to read this and be talking about it. I think the incarceration system in general, regardless of what country you're dealing with, this being specifically about the US, is so important, and something I don't think a lot of us think about, or at least going on my experience, I didn't think about it for a very long time. You know, maybe it occurred to me now and then that there was some injustices within it. Even though I was very politically minded, I was aware of the fact that most women in prison are there for non-violent crimes, but it wasn't until a few years ago that I really started educating myself on prisons and the incarceration system, and really just realising how unjust and cruel they are, and it really made me quite passionate about prison reform, and it really made me think that it was a topic of great importance and that more people needed to be talking about it. And this book, I think, is an incredible, if harrowing, insight into life in women's prisons in the US, but I think a lot of the things that happen in these institutions in the US do happen elsewhere as well. And I've never actually read a book before that specifically and exclusively dealt with women's voices, so I really appreciated that. Like I said, it's lots of different voices as well, so there was like a broad spectrum of women covered there, although there definitely was an emphasis on women from like more unfortunate backgrounds, highlighting that women, and I'm sure the same is true of men, who come from like lower income, impoverished backgrounds, perhaps with difficulty in their pasts, how they often are even more victimised by the system, if that makes sense. There is a lot of exploration of sexual abuse within the prison system, and that is, you know, employees of the prison system like guards, and the sexual abuse they put prisoners from, the horrific medical care. There's a woman in here who gets her ovaries removed without her consent or knowledge, and doesn't find out until years later that they even did this to her. She went in for some other procedure, and say there was perhaps some complications, but they didn't feel in any way like they owed her really anything as a human or a patient, or any communication, because she was under the charge of the state, and so many other things like that. And I think even though I knew prison was a mess, I think it's really important to hear these voices from real people and their real stories, and have them all here in the one place to kind of show all of the different horrors they faced as individuals, and also the overlapping things that come up again and again and again. And I just think this book is incredible, if hard, like I said, and one I would really encourage you to pick up. Overall, I really just couldn't fault it. We then have a much shorter non-fiction book, and that is No One Is Too Small to Make a Difference by Greta Thunberg. This is a collection, again, this is kind of like oral history in a way, because this is just a very short collection released from Penguin last year of Greta Thunberg's speeches. You probably recognise her. She is the really amazing young teenage woman from Sweden out there talking about climate change. And I thought this book was really great in general. Because it is a collection of speeches, there's a lot of repetition. It's only about 60 odd pages long, and the same sentences and the same sentiments come up again and again because they were speeches she's delivered at different places. It's not a book that's been specifically written to be read, if that makes sense. But I think in a way all of those points need to be hammered home, so it's quite interesting seeing those speeches that are perhaps all on the same topic so condensed and closely packed together. I also really liked how she deals with the criticism she often faces for being young. Like, young people shouldn't have opinions, they should just be going to school and learning and not going out there kicking up a fuss or going on strike. And the way she addresses those people is by saying, I'm not actually here to try and tell you I'm the climate expert, I'm here to tell you I have learned what's going on, I have listened to the scientists and you need to listen to them too because this is imminent. And what I think this book really puts across is how imminent an issue climate change is. The only thing that I would really criticise out of the whole book was one sentence where she said that this is not a political issue, and I think really what she meant is this is like a non-partisan issue. But for me, global warming is very political because it requires government's involvement. You know, we're not going to solve the climate crisis unless governments get on board with changing the way we run our countries and we live our lives, and combating global warming from like a top-down level, because a lot of the like massive impact on the environment going on around us is from a top-down level. You know, I can stop buying fast fashion and plastic bottles, but unless, you know, sort of the capitalist system that prioritises profit over people and now the planet is in some way impeded or changed, you know, we're not going to solve the problem. So for me, I would consider that political, but I think that was just more of like a turn of phrase that I wouldn't have necessarily used, but is not really reflective of what I think of the book overall, which I think is really great. I think it's a really nice, simple, straightforward address to climate change and why we all need to be kicking up a fuss and making people listen to us in the same way that Greta is, which is incredible that she's doing that. And if she can do it, then all of us can. What is inside this book you can probably listen to on YouTube, as a lot of her speeches have been recorded, but it was nice to also read it in a little book form, and my library had a copy, so I'm quite happy that I picked it up. We then, however, move on to the fiction. First up is The Kiss Quotient by Helen Huang. This is the first book in a series, each of the books in the series following a different protagonist. So it's one of those series where the books essentially function as standalones, but they have reoccurring characters. And in this book we follow a young man and a young woman. I think the woman's about 30 and the man's about 28, something like that. I believe that was their ages. It's not really that important though. And our female protagonist, Stella, has autism. Because of this and the expectation on her to find a relationship and get married, she decides to hire an escort to help her learn how to date. At first it starts off as a help me get good at sex deal, and then it becomes a help me learn actually the ins and outs of dating, go on dates with me, fake date me so I know what it's like to be in a relationship and I know what to expect in the future. And of course it's a romance novel. She falls in love with the male lead who is the escort. I've only recently gotten into the contemporary romance genre, and this book is one that people adore, so I had to read it. They also seem to love the second book, The Bride Test, and I do plan on picking that up. And overall I completely agree. I think this is just a really great fun romance. It has a lot of the things that I have found that I enjoy about romance, which is the kind of like pure joy and escapism they offer, but it also challenges the romance genre as a genre that can be quite undiverse, the opposite of diverse. It often portrays the same men and women over and over and over again, whereas this book obviously features a neurodivergent protagonist, and I think that that was wonderfully done. So I'm really pleased to know that there are books in the romance genre out there, and that I can also continue to seek out more diverse romance as I'm getting into the genre. Again, only small criticism was I felt like their feelings for one another were very, very quick, but that is true of a lot of romance, if not all romance, from what I've read so far. I just felt particularly in the case of the male lead that his feelings developed super duper quickly, given that I would have assumed he had a lot of rules set up for himself as an escort to make sure that like he even says in the book, clients don't end up stalking him or end up having an unhealthy relationship with him. But he kind of breaks a lot of those rules very quickly at the beginning. But I think, again, suspension of disbelief, it's about their relationship, and they do both show a lot of respect for each other, and it turns into what is really a lovely relationship, and overall I really enjoyed it. One I wasn't as enamoured with, it's not that it was a bad book, it just didn't wow me, was The Scandalous, Dissolute, No Good Mr. Right, which is a novella by Tessa Dare. Tessa Dare is like my champion of romance. She is the author that really convinced me I was a romance reader, and that was only last year. She writes historical Regency romances, and this is another one of those. It's also the 4th novella by her I've read. So I've read quite a few novels and quite a few novellas now by her. 2 of the novellas I've read were part of a series. So they were basically just shorter stories about minor characters. And then, like this book, I've read one other novella by her which was a standalone, and I just don't think the standalone novellas work as well because they're too short for me to care. If that makes sense. You know, I need relationship development, I need a little bit of tension and different things to happen for me to really get involved in a romance. And with the novellas that were set within a series, I felt at least I'd met those characters before. I understood them in the context of the you know, backdrop it was set in because I'd read the novels, so I really enjoyed that. However, the 2 standalone novellas I read by her, although they were like quick fun reads, really didn't stick with me or make me fall in love with the characters in the way I do with her novels or novellas set in a series, if that makes sense. However, I'm happy enough I read it. I don't know if I'm going to remember the plot past a month from now, but it was fun enough, and if you like Tessa Dare, then I would, you know, go ahead and read it. It's just not where I would start with her. I would suggest going for one of the first books in her actual series that is a novel. And I was about to move on and I realised I hadn't even told you the plot of it. That shows how kind of just like quickly it has gone from my mind. It is about a young woman basically who falls in love with a man. Like, that is basically the plot, and their romance stretches out over a few years and a few different meetings, but again, because it's so short, that kind of time span thing just kind of flitted past me a little bit. So I think I gave this one a 3-star read because it was fine, it was fun, but a little bit forgettable. We then have LaGuardia Volume 1 by Nnedi Okorafor, illustrated by Tana Ford. This is, obviously, since the words volume and illustrated suggest, a comic book series, and this is the first bind up of that comic book, including 4 issues of the story. I actually have no idea when the next volume is out. I'm not even sure if a issue 5 is out. I couldn't see on Goodreads an issue 5, so I don't really know what the future is for this series. But as a volume by itself, I very much enjoyed it. It's set in a futuristic Earth where the borders of Earth have been opened up to aliens from other planets. So we have a lot of immigration happening in different countries of alien species from different planets, but we also still have massive problems with racism towards different races on Earth. So our 2 main characters are a black man and a black woman, and they still deal with a lot of prejudice towards them, and I thought that that was really well done, because I think often when you see books that explore issues like racism or any sort of discrimination through science fiction, the contemporary groups that the metaphor is essentially standing in for are erased in place of the fictional creatures like the aliens. So you get like humans versus outer space aliens, whereas this book was like, look, we've got humans, we've got outer space aliens, but we still have prejudice within the humans, and I thought that that was really well done. But it also, through using the science fiction setting, managed to just like shine a magnifying glass on the issues of like anti-immigration sentiment and racism in general in contemporary society, although it's set in the future. And I really enjoyed that. I thought it was really well illustrated. I loved the pictures. I loved all the different aliens from all the different planets. I thought were so beautiful and so beautifully drawn. I just loved seeing that world come to life. It was so vivid, and it really worked in graphic novel or comic book form. Like I mentioned, we have a male and a female protagonist who are an engaged couple. The man who is Nigerian and the woman who is American Nigerian, and she has just travelled back to America because she's currently pregnant. But from the offset, there seems to be a bit of tension between her and her fiance, and there's something going on that you're not quite clear on, and it means she's a little bit scared for the future of her child, and that all sort of comes to fruition, and you learn more about that as the book progresses. And I don't know what else to say about it without giving away spoilers, but I definitely think it's worth checking out. Nnedi Okorafor is an author whose fiction I have read before and absolutely adored. She's definitely a favourite sci-fi fantasy author for me, so it was really nice to see her work in a new format, and I will check out the future volumes and issues when they do crop up, whenever that is, so would recommend. And then last but not least, I have another novella, or maybe short story. I think this was 41 pages, so I don't know what category that comes into, and that is A Dead Djinn in Cairo by P. Jelly Clark. I have again read a novella by this author in the past. This wasn't my first foray into their fiction, but this combines so many things I love. Like, this was fantastic, because this was basically a detective novel set in 1920s Cairo, I think it was. It was definitely the first half of the 1900s, but an alternative Cairo in an alternative world that blends science fiction and fantasy together. I was actually thinking about that when I was reading it. There must be a word for that genre, right, that blends fantasy and sci-fi. If you know what that word is, let me know, although I might end up googling it whilst I'm editing this. Hi, editing Jean, who has suddenly remembered to Google that topic. But it is one of those books that blends the two together. We have technology and magical creatures coexisting, and it was such a fascinating world. So only 40 pages. Basically, we start off with a dead djinn in Cairo who appears to have committed suicide, but that is very strange. No djinn has been known before to have committed suicide, and our detective, who appears to be maybe the only female detective on the Cairo police force, thinks there's something suspicious, so starts investigating, and obviously by the end of the book kind of figures out what was going on. I really liked our main character, and I really liked the world this was set in. I thought it was so interesting. You've got jinn, you've got angels, you've got ghouls, you've got humans, you've got magicians, and everything in between, and it just seems so rich, and I felt so curious about learning more about this world. I've actually just looked it up on my phone, and it's 1912, not 1920, apologies. However, because it is so short, you don't actually get to spend a ton of time in the world or with that character, which may be a little bit sad, although that's also a reflection that it was an interesting enough world that I cared enough to know more, if that makes sense. It's like that bittersweet double-edged sword of it being so interesting and it doing something so wonderful that it made me want more, but there wasn't more. However, I do know that the author has set another short work in this world that I think is a little bit longer, maybe in the 100 and something page mark, called The Hunting of Tramcar 015, which I will be reading because, like I said, it's set in the same world, and I thought this was such an interesting world. However, it's not about the same protagonist, which makes me a little bit sad, because I really liked our detective Fatima, and there was a sort of queer element that came into play near the end, and I would have loved to learn more about her like adventures as a detective, and potentially seeing her go off and have exciting relationships with other women. I don't think that's going to happen, because I don't think he has any other books set in this world about that character, although that's not to say that the author never will, and I'm just checking that, yeah, so the other book, The Haunting of Tramcar 015, is about the police force, but we follow a different officer called Hamed, so yeah, it is about a different main character. So again, really glad that I get to read more set in that world, because like I said, it was so rich and detailed, but left me wanting more. But I am a little bit sad that that's all I get of Fatima, because she just sounded so awesome, and I really enjoyed her character. But what are you going to do? And that's everything I read in the second half of the month. Well, it's not everything I read, because I'm actually in the middle of 2 other books. I just haven't finished them, so you will see those in my mid-month wrap-up for February, I'm sure. But do let me know if you've read any of the books I've talked about here. I would love to chat about them with you, or if you've read anything else by any of these authors. I'd also love to hear any recommendations that you have, perhaps based on what I've talked about here, because all in all, they were all pretty good, and as you can tell, I'm kind of enjoying my historical sci-fi fantasy. I'm enjoying both my contemporary and historical romances, and my super intense non-fiction. So there's, you know, plenty there to kind of chat about and get recommendations for. But until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye guys!